Happy October, ladies and gentlemen. I've been thinking on how I could possibly start off this month of videos where I try to take a look at any game with scary or horror themed elements. So, why not start with Castlevania? Now, this isn't going to be like a whole ass review of every single Castlevania game I haven't talked about. Otherwise, this video would be going on until the end of October. So, I'm just going to take a look at some of the ones that I haven't talked about yet. So, roll the intro. Enjoy the show. Alright, more Castlevania games. Now, the way I'm working with this is that I'm taking a look at the games that I didn't talk about in my timeline revisit, either because they were retconned or were non-canon to begin with. So let's start off with the most infamous of Castlevania games, or rather, two of the most infamous Castlevania games. Now, when it comes to 3D Castlevania games, there are often two that people think of, those being Lords of Shadow 1 and 2, which I'll get to soon, and these two. One is simply titled Castlevania, but us fans refer to it as Castlevania 64, and the other is called Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. These are two of the first attempts to bring Castlevania into 3D. I mean, Mario already did it with Mario 64, and the Zelda series did it with Ocarina of Time, and those games played pretty alright. But when it comes to these games, the controls are just utter shit. Now let's start with Castlevania 64, released here in America in late January of 1999. Now already there's an issue. The story. You see, this game is set in the year of 1852, so this is already bringing up a question. Which game in the timeline came first? Order of Ecclesia or this? Since we don't have a specified year for Ecclesia, obviously we don't know whether to put 64 before or after Ecclesia, so basically it got retconned because of that. Secondly, the game controls like a plate shit. The jumping is stiff. I know this is supposed to try and bring the series into 3D, but did they really have to try and bring the stiff jumping along for the ride? This came out after Symphony of the Night, so you think they would try to copy notes from Mario 64 and Symphony and try to make the game control at least decent, but no. Lastly, it's attacking. It is so awkward. I feel like I hit out of sheer luck. Why isn't there a lock-on button like in Ocarina of Time? This is a hack and slash game, people, and a hack and slash game with no lock-on, unless you're playing the original and actual good God of War games, isn't a hack and slash. Overall though, while there was an attempt to bring the series into 3D, the controls are just what kills it for me. But would you believe that there was a remastered version of this released in November of the same year? Say hello to Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, released in November of 1999, where its main purpose is to try and expand as well as remaster Castlevania 64. Now, much like 64, Legacy is also set during the 19th century, this time 1844. So again, much like 64, it got retconned because Ecclesia has no set fucking year. Now, while the game does control somewhat better than 64, the stiff jumping is still present in this, but at least the attacking isn't as bad. Plus, Cornell, who is the only new playable character in this game, has a better projectile attack compared to Reinhardt with the Vampire Killer. Yeah, the story of both of these games are set after Richter Belmont tainted the bloodline back in Symphony. Now, while both of these games are flawed, if you have to play one of them, I say go for Legacy of Darkness. Alright, now what other games can I take a look at? Ooh, what happens when you try to cram a CD-based game into a 16-bit cartridge? You get Castlevania Dracula X, released in September of 1995 for the Super Nintendo. The game is meant to be an adaptation of Rondo of Blood, which is actually canon to the timeline. But Dracula X on the Super Nintendo, while alright, it's just a watered down port. First of all, Richter walks like he is dragging his feet across the ground. Compare this to Rondo and you see the difference. Now, because of Richter's slow-ass walk, I always find myself jumping, but jumping ends up being a risk, because much like in the original Rondo of Blood, the jumping has been resorted back to the NES jumping of old. At least the music still has that Castlevania tune. Hell, sometimes I think Dracula X's version of Divine Bloodlines is better than Rondo's, even though that uses CD-based audio. But let's talk about the final boss fight against Dracula himself. I'm being brutally honest, this is by far the hardest version of the fight against the Prince of Darkness I had ever done. Yes, even harder than the American version of Dracula's Curse. Hope you like Bottomless Pits because they are fucking everywhere. One wrong move and your ass is dead. I mean, at least his second form is somewhat easier to deal with. Just stand away as far as possible, have the cross as a sub-weapon, and spam the hell out of the Belmont side special with added whipping. Apparently, the reason why this version of the Dracula fight is harder than the one found in Rondo is because people say the one in Rondo is easier. This is why you need to watch what you say, otherwise we end up with shit like this. But overall, Castlevania Dracula X is actually pretty alright. Not as good as Rondo, but for the last 2D classic style of Castlevania, this is pretty alright. Now I say we jump to a handheld this time. Yep, I mentioned this game a few times during my timeline revisit. This is Castlevania Legends for the Nintendo Game Boy. Now, Legends was released in November of 1997 for the OG Game Boy, and I can certainly say that after playing the horrid atrocity that was the Christopher Belmont duology, I was expecting Legends to be shit as well, but to my shock, this is still kinda slow, but certainly better than Adventure. Now, why was this game retconned out? Well, that's because of two reasons. The first one was actually a pretty legitimate reason. That is because of the year Legends took place in, that being 1450. Basically 26 years before the events of Castlevania 3. So that just ends up fucking up all sorts of events prior to Castlevania 3. So that's why this is actually a pretty legit reason. The second reason might be a bit on the controversial side, so bear with me here. The other reason why Legends was retconned is because from the mouth of Koji Igarashi himself, it was historically inaccurate to depict women like that during the 15th century.
Bullshit. Bullshit.
But enough talking about the reasons. We take the role of the first female Belmont in the series, that being Sonia Belmont. Gameplay wise, it's pretty alright. Music is actually pretty great. We even got the classic Vampire Killer and the Bloody Tears tracks. So overall, this is actually pretty good for the third attempt of a Game Boy Castlevania game. So those are some of the other Castlevania games that I didn't cover during my revisit, and if I have to pick which one is my definitive favorite, I'd say Dracula X is my favorite. But of course, I want to know from you all, did you play any of these games that I just mentioned? What did you think of them, and are they games you would recommend to a friend? Leave your answers and more down in the comments. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and while you're here, consider subscribing and turn on the bell to be notified whenever I make a new video. As always, my social media links are down below. I've been Howard, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody.